So, Chandran, we are here in Davos, and I haven't heard a single climate denier. I mean, everybody seems to accept that it's really important. So, aren't you happy?
Well, it's nice that, at the superficial level, everyone's saying yes, yes, yes. And then you go to the other discussions about, growth, consumption, etc., and everyone's saying more, more, more. And what I'm saying is we need to stop this sort of denial. On one hand, superficially saying we all agree that climate change is a risk, and then every other action we take is completely opposite. And as I said in my talk, we can ask Asians to consume more and then say at the same time, Asia will need to reduce its emissions because of climate change. And that's the denial I think we should confront.
Why are people saying to Asians to consume more?
Well, if you look at most of the discussions here, but in the last 3 or 4 years, as we've had the global financial crisis, and the savior was meant to be Asian consumers. 3 to 4 billion Asians who have not consumed as much to the levels in the West. If they consumed more, apparently the world's economy will be rebalanced and everything will be okay. So that's been the narrative in the financial world, in the sort of political circles, etc. But at the same time, we know that if 3 billion Asians consume, like the average European or American, then you have no chance of meeting any of those emission standards.
Somebody else must have noticed the contradiction here.
Well, I think a lot of people do notice that, and perhaps I should not say a lot, but I think a few people do. The difficulty is articulating that in the leading platforms of the world, be they political or business. And therefore, even in the international media, the best newspapers in the world, there's a great tendency to talk on one hand about rebalancing global economy, and then there'll be a separate piece somewhere else about, don't we all care about the planet and the climate?
The left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing.
Yeah, and I call it absolute denial. And until the political leaders and the business leaders and the media start to connect this, we will have this very fudged approach, both to how do we reshape the global economy, which is an important thing, and how do we deal with the consequences of a consumption-led economic model. We need to connect this. And in my small way, I'm trying to say, if we don't connect this, we are either lying, highly irresponsible, or we are just simply in denial.
But you and I know that the real situation is really frightening, and people don't want to be frightened. In fact, we have people here saying it's bad psychology to frighten people because then they'll do even less. The barriers will go up even higher. How do you deal with the fact that you may create more denial?
Well, I think denial is quite different from scaring people, right? I think speaking the truth will get people to understand where we are and then start to shape discussions. The problem is, at the moment, is the global elite, particularly our political leaders in liberal democracies, are so reluctant to speak the truth. Speaking the truth is not to scare people necessarily. There's an element of fear, but how you deliver that message. And in my view, this message needs to be about, when we talk about constraints, we talk about those challenges, it's not the end of the world. But what we will have to talk about is how rebalancing the global economy, reshaping capitalism, will actually create fairer societies. Fairer societies should make most of us feel more secure, and therefore feel, hey, we need to change because more people will share in the prosperity within a constrained planet. I don't think this is a negative message. I don't think people will be scared. But we don't have political leaders who are willing and able to tell the story.
So do you think that fairness and greenness go together?
Of course, I mean, it's social justice. But, I'm also reluctant to get into the language too deeply, because then you get accused of being some sort of hippie, green, a greenie, etc. So I try and bring it right into the center of the discussion about politics, political objectives, the role of government, the contract with society, the role of business in relation to society, and how that should be discussed, and how do we organize ourselves. And particularly my interest is in the Asia-Pacific region because it's the most populated region in the world. The other thing I think we have all got trapped in is this idea that somehow you must just create hope. So you got all the sort of do-gooders going around talking about hope and, have faith. Well, that's all well and good, but as I often say, hope ain't a plan. And we need a plan.
Hope ain't a plan.
Yeah, and it's become very seductive. It's become kind of Hollywood sort of thing. Everyone wants to talk about and become ambassadors while making B movies, right? And then you want to talk about hope. Well, we can all be hopeful, but we better have a plan because this is a very serious issue.
And what kind of plan would you like to see if you rule the world? What would be your plan?
Well, I don't think anyone should rule the world, but in terms of at least having a more honest discussion about constraints, the thing that I discuss in the book is essentially this.
The book?
In my book called The Consumptionomics and Asia's role in reshaping capitalism and saving the planet. Not because Asians have superior values or are they more intelligent, it's just that the numbers matter. So 5 billion Asians in 2050 cannot live like the Western world does. This is not to criticize the West, it's just a reality of where we are. It is not unfair, therefore, to suggest to the Asian world, you cannot have the same things, but we need to have something very different, but which will create more just societies and therefore more secure, I'll use the Chinese word, harmonious societies. Now, therefore, I suggest that in the 21st century, if you accept that resources are constrained, and all the science points to this, then you will accept that, I argue that resource management must be at the center of all policy making at the national level and at the regional level. This is not so. This is not the model that we have adopted. So there are 3 principles that I say we should adopt. First, if resources are constrained, then we should make economic activity subservient to maintaining the vitality of natural resources. You can't live off your iPad. You will need water, fresh air, food, etc. So that's very important. Secondly, if resources are to be shared equitably between present and future generations, then we should be very clear that resources must be shared in a way that all generations can use it. And in those terms, I talk about common welfare rather than individual rights, which goes against the grain of Western liberal democracies, and we can talk about what rights mean. And the last point I make is we have to redefine productivity around resource use rather than people.
Okay, so you said we have to redefine what rights mean. How do you define rights?
Well, I would argue that, and it's very clear, it's very easy for people like us who have been lucky, who have most of the basic essentials of life, to think that the majority of human beings live like this. Actually, the majority of human beings don't live like you and me. And we've been lucky, maybe whatever backgrounds we've come from, but we are the minority. I mean, I live in
tiny minority.
Yes, I live in Hong Kong, and I tell them every time I speak in Hong Kong, this is not the real world. This is Disneyland. So is Singapore, etc. The majority of human beings don't have access to safe and secure food. They don't have access to water and sanitation. They don't have access to proper housing. They don't have access to public health. And they don't have access to proper education, right? So if you take the education one out, the 4 others are essential to human existence. The majority of human beings don't have this. So when we talk about rights, there's a fetish in the West about, the right to demonstrate, which is, but for me, the most important rights are the right to safe and secure food, the right to water and sanitation. And I would argue that, I think India would be better off if the average Indian had access to water and sanitation, and rather than just the right to vote. And then, of course, the right to health care. So those are the fundamental rights people need. And it's more important than just the ability to protest.
But isn't part of that right to have a phone, if that ability to speak up, to amplify your voice and to connect with others so you can join up in solidarity to amplify that need, that right, then isn't that a good use of the phone? I mean, I agree, if the phone is used simply for entertainment, that's a different matter. But or for, superficial things. But if the phone is actually used...
What, the mobile phone?
Yes.
No, of course. I mean, no one's denying that people should organize. But when people need to organize to protest and etc., they only do that because there's been a failure of the institutions, right? So the institutions, which is where I'm coming back, of the countries in Asia should firstly reject the consumption-led economic model, which allows you to underprice everything. So, the irony is poor people can't have toilets, but they can have a phone. And I don't want to go into the details, but how is it they can have a phone? Because it's totally underpriced. And we can go through the whole chain of sequence of how they can own the phone, which essentially deprives them of other things. Okay? So I let people connect the dots on that one. But the fact that the phone is so cheap for the poorest people, but the toilets and everything else is so expensive, become a luxury, talks to my argument about the underpricing of resources. So governments really focus on creating an economic model around which the most basic needs of people are met. And that's their obligation to the rights of people. Rather than letting this sort of voodoo economics suggest that somehow things will trickle down. And as I've said before, the gravy's too thick. It doesn't trickle down. In a resource-constrained world, we will be left with a whole lot of people much worse than they are now. So firstly, economic models around meeting the most basic rights, which is the ones I've mentioned.
So we talk about the gravy being too thick, and then it won't trickle down. That's a great phrase. But the people who have, for the last 50 years, certainly, possibly longer, had the most gravy, the people in the US, for example, they're the people who are talking about smaller government, whereas, they despise, some of the right wing in the US despise government, even to provide education or to provide healthcare. It's extraordinary that people are voting in people who are taking away their basic rights to healthcare and education, but that's what they're doing. And so, and they have a tremendous control over the airwaves and the media. So how are you seem to be wanting the state to have a much more powerful role in protecting people and their rights. And, you're one person with a microphone here. How are you going to combat this huge media machine going the other way?
I think the Chinese government agrees with me.
Well, that is a big,
okay.
big institution on that microphone.
Right, but but what I'm saying is that there are models out there. Now, I'm not suggesting for once that I'm an apologist for the extremes of any government, right? But the point I'm trying to make is we in the developing world have for far too long been intellectually subservient and looked to the West for models. At the same time, as you said, the environment, the American economic model has been thrust on us ideologically. They rule the airwaves, the newspapers, etc., and said, we are the best, you guys can follow us, and if you are like us, we will accept you. I'm saying that, now look, and there's a strong sentiment in the Asia-Pacific region, something wrong with that model. It's very obvious. All I'm suggesting is don't be so intellectually subservient. There are many things in the US or Europe you can learn from, but their whole perspective on where the progress of human progress comes from a very different history, one of privilege, dominance, and entitlement. You have to understand this. And I'm not trying to have a rant about the colonial past, etc., but you have to understand that for the last 200-300 years, a small minority of people had access to all the resources of the world. That has changed. The problem we have now in the Asia-Pacific is our elite, still intellectually subservient, who went to those schools, came back with only one ideology, and thought this is the only thing on the menu. And that's where the ideological struggle is, the neoliberal narrative. All I'm trying to do, yes, with one microphone, but I'm having a bit of an impact, is to say, hey, there is a different narrative. And I can tell you that every time I speak in Asia, whether it's policymakers, business leaders, no one pushes back. Because the reality of what's going on is so obvious.
The consequences.
The consequences are obvious for everyone to see. And what I've tried to do, and I don't want to overstate the impact, is mainstream an idea that was seen as taboo. Because you had the Western narrative that said, you can have everything. And it's difficult for the Western world, even understanding constraints, to now tell the developing world you can't have it. So instead, the narrative becomes, you can have it, and we can help you have it because we can all innovate, we can have technology, and free markets will solve. This is a lie. This is an absolute lie. But you can understand why, from a Western point of view, this narrative has to be put forth.
Well, this is the media again, isn't it? Because it's not only the political patterns or the economic patterns, it's the glamour. It's the glamour of the West. It's got a kind of a magic.
No, of course. I mean,
and that's so...
Glamour comes from a whole, I don't want to, I'm not an expert at studying the entire psychological effects of 200 years or 300 years of colonial rule. But, as Kishore Mahbubani said yesterday in a session he was being interviewed, he said, as a young boy, he, in Singapore, felt that white people were just superior to him. So I think it's very difficult for someone from the West to understand how that inferiority complex is wired in to hundreds of millions of people around the region.
Well, Bishop Tutu said the same thing in his autobiography, or his biography. One of the biographies, he says how he had swallowed it and internalized it, and it's always the issue, isn't it? That if you've internalized an oppressive thought, then you have to overcome not only the oppressor outside, but the internalized oppressor. So you have one and a half of you.
Exactly, and you have to be very strong to reject it. I remember as a kid, when television arrived, I always remember that we were, the first TV programs we got were sort of the Western Hollywood movies. And it's very interesting that in the Western Hollywood movies, John Wayne was the hero and the Indians were the bad guys. Of course, only later on did we find out that Geronimo was actually the good guy and John Wayne was the bad guy. This is propaganda. Similarly with female beauty, blonde, blue-eyed Marilyn Monroe. No one talked about some Indian lady or some Malay or African. So this is very steeped, and you should not underestimate how this still exists. And that's why the luxury brands, are so popular in China, India, etc., because people want to be like what they think is better.
Well, I think in my experience, the most insidious version of this is with baby foods, because the bottle is the glamour of the West again, of the free woman, whereas the breast is somehow sort of some human. Yeah, exactly. It's primitive and it's sort of icky. And also that leads to another issue, isn't it? Because then it's about being cut off above the neck and below the neck. Somehow below the neck is icky and above the neck is cerebral and intellectual and fine. But it's also about disconnection from the physical reality of your body and the physical body of the planet.
That's right.
And we just use the planet intellectually as a commodity rather than the reality of the physical body of nature.
That's right. I think these things are extremely profound issues that we can discuss. My main focus is on trying to get a political narrative in the Asia-Pacific region around the realities of constraints and on getting political leaders to understand that as we move to a planet with 10, and maybe by the end of this century to 15, the most populous part of the world must need to understand not everyone can own a car, not everyone can do anything they want, and that there has to be a collective welfare embedded in how we institutionalize, therefore, the way we organize ourselves. Call it rules if you want. And that's such an important discussion to have, rather than the discussion at the moment, which is somehow growth will solve poverty issues. It will not. And it will not. And I argue in my book again that this trajectory will get us to a halfway point. Things will collapse. And I'm not talking about, catastrophic decline of the human population, but things will get very bad, and the majority will be left behind. And therefore, the arguments for governments to listen to this narrative is their legitimacy will depend on actually moving quickly so that more people can enjoy the most essential rights for human existence, which is the three things I talked about. Human existence does not need 2 cars. If we can have it, okay, but we can't, and we need to understand this. And so quite often I'm asked by Asians who don't push back, understand, but this isn't unfair on Asians. I say we should move beyond the unfair. This is where we are at this time in history. And if we want to create a more equitable and therefore safer world, we better start to share resources. And that's really what I'm talking about.
Well, thank you so much, Chandran. It was very moving as well as very eloquent. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.